Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This is Alexander Lim, and welcome to Author Story. Our featured book for this episode is Education for Liberation: The Politics of Promise and Reform Inside and Beyond America's Prisons, which you can check out by clicking on the Amazon link in the video description below. Gerald Robinson is the author and our guest, and he has served as the Commissioner for Education in the state of Florida. He is presently the Executive Director of the Center for Advancing Opportunity, headquartered in Washington, D.C. So, Gerald, welcome to Author Story.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
You're welcome. So, Gerald, first off, what is the Center for Advancing Opportunity, and what is it that you guys do?
The Center for Advancing Opportunity is an education and research initiative in Washington, D.C., created through a partnership between the Charles Koch Foundation, Koch Industries, and the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. The Thurgood Marshall College Fund is the largest organization in the country, focused primarily on supporting students who attend historically black colleges and universities, 47 of which are member schools. This partnership was created for two reasons. The first was to identify barriers and identify avenues to make people stronger as it relates to education, criminal justice, and entrepreneurship. There are a lot of barriers. The question is, how do we solve them? The second thing we do is we invest money into scholars and students at historically black colleges, universities, and other post-secondary institutions to actually create a solution to why are so many people not graduating high school on time? And if they are, why are so many people enrolled in remediation? Why is it that people identify the number one reason they want to move is because of crime in their area? Or the number of people who want to create business, who says, even if I have the finances, I choose not to. Well, the question is why and what can we do? So we're created to answer those questions.
Okay, got that. So I guess your book also, it revolves around this theme of finding out solutions, finding out problems and possible solutions for this. Education for Liberation. How did this book come about? Was it something that was percolating for several years, or did you just have an aha moment and you decide to write it?
My involvement in working with justice-involved youth goes back to the late 1980s when I was an undergraduate student at Howard University, when D.C., some would say, was the murder capital of the country. There was a lot of drug abuse, a lot of drug dealing, just a lot of violence. And so I began to involve myself with young men in the city who, had one foot on jail and another foot on a banana peel. And so from the 80s moving forward, I've always had an interest, but particularly what role can education play in helping minimize the problem? So fast forward to 2015, we have the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. We have the response to that, not only in Baltimore, but nationally. So at the time, I was a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. I connected with two colleagues. One is the co-author or co-editor of my book, Elizabeth English Smith.
Right.
And the other person we work with is Sean Kennedy. And we decided through our conversation that criminal justice reform shouldn't be a partisan issue, that there were a lot of Republicans who were equally interested in the role education had to play in criminal justice reform. So we decided from a right of center perspective to get involved with people left of center and all centers, really just across the board. So that started in 2015, and that led to me, Elizabeth, Sean, sometimes in different groups, traveling to prisons across the United States, talking to people who were formerly incarcerated, talking to those who were incarcerated, talking to correctional officers and scholars, and that led to what you now see, a edited book.
Wow. So I take it that, a lot of research and a lot of time has gone into creating the book.
Well, anyone out there who's put together a book understands it's a labor of love in a great way. It was a matter of finding the right authors for the book. In the book itself, we have a total of 10 chapters. Chapter 10, in fact, is written by people who at the time either were incarcerated or were at one point incarcerated, but who benefited from an education program.
Right.
We have authors who are university-based scholars. We have authors who work for think tanks. We have an author who's a president of a university. We have an author who's a former deputy mayor in the city of New York. So we've got a nice mix of people who were impacted, people who are researchers, people who are entrepreneurs, and people who are advocates.
Okay, okay, got that. So, all right. So it's I mean, you got your information then from a lot of sources, and so this, I'd say this, would you say then this pretty thorough in its, in the way it's researched?
It's thorough in the way that it's researched, but it's narrow in its focus.
Right,
And so
right.
when I say education for liberation, I want your listenership to know three things.
Mm,
We primarily focused on the role of education in preparing people for post-secondary degrees, but we also mentioned the fact that the majority of the people who are incarcerated, and there are 2.3 million who are in our federal and state prisons, the
mm,
majority of them who are taking education courses are either adult basic education,
mm,
and some are adult secondary education. That's where you can earn a GED or high school diploma. The
right, right.
third lane is vocational training, and then the fourth is post-secondary.
Mm,
The second thing we do is we're talking about people that once they're in, how do we prepare them to re-enter? So it's all
right,
back end work. We
right.
don't address front end work, which deals with bail,
Mm,
unfair sentencing. And the third thing is we take the position that we believe that education matters. We talk about workforce. In fact, there's an entire chapter dedicated to the workforce.
right.
So it's a narrow slice,
Mm,
thoroughly researched, but it's a lane that we think we can add something to the conversation.
right, right. Okay. So first, let's get to what's so. I mean, what's so with the present situation? What is the present situation with regard to the judicial, the correctional system? Like, how many people are incarcerated?
So we have 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in state and
Wow.
federal prison. The
Okay.
vast majority of them are in state prison.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
When you look at education, in states like California, it's said that 70% of the people who are there did not finish high school.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we know that now in the state of Maryland, if you are incarcerated in a state prison and you do not have a high school diploma, you have to enroll into a GED program. So states
Mm-hmm.
have different ways of addressing the education issue. What's most important is that 650,000 people leave prison every year.
Mm-hmm.
650,000, that's roughly the size of the city of Memphis
Wow.
in Tennessee. And of the 2.3 million who are incarcerated today,
Uh-huh.
guess what? 95% are going to leave prison one day. Question is, how do we want them to return to society?
Right, right. I mean, that figure alone, 2.3 million people. I mean, when I think of like an economy, 2.3 million workers. I mean, 2.3 million people with jobs. That's a sizable slice.
Well, we incarcerate more people per capita than any other nation in, I would say, the Western world. And I say the Western world because countries like Russia and China, where there's less transparency than we have in the United States, they very well could have a higher number of people, either percentage or sheer number, who are incarcerated, but we don't know.
Mm,
But within what we call the Western world or industrialized nations that support free market systems, we have the highest in the country. And places like Oklahoma incarcerates more women per capita than
mm,
any place in the country.
mm. Right. So, Gerald, let's for the sake of our listeners who, have not encountered a prisoner, who have not had experience with someone who's been in prison. What's it like for someone who's been incarcerated and then he gets out? What's it like for him or her?
I'll give you a perfect example. I know a gentleman who was released from prison 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
After 26 years,
Wow. Okay.
he received a government ID
Mm-hmm.
so that he can say, I am the person who I am.
Mm-hmm.
He received $200,
Mm-hmm.
enough money to leave the prison and to transfer to, or to go to a transition house.
Right. Right.
Once you're in a transition house, you've got to find a job. That happens to men and women daily who leave prison.
Mm-hmm.
Some is $50, some is $200. It could be higher or
Right.
lower.
Right.
Some states and counties have programs in place where they have transitional housing. Other
Uh-huh.
places do not. There's
Okay.
some cities where nonprofit, for-profit, or faith-based communities
Mm-hmm.
have transitional houses set up. Or in the case of Will Heaton, who's an author of one of the chapters in our book, um, Will has a chapter, his chapter 8 is called The Importance of Work. And
Mm-hmm.
this organization he used to work for helped people find jobs when they leave, and more importantly, they received a paycheck every single day.
Mm-hmm.
So the transition's been tough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, trying to reconnect with family sometimes is tougher. You
Mm-hmm.
know, over 50% of the women who are incarcerated are mothers.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have not seen their children for 1, 2, 3, or more years. So
Right.
there are a lot of socioeconomic, familial challenges that take place. Some things the government can address, some things it cannot. But I've heard that story across state lines. And so that's what most men and women experience when they leave.
Right, right. So, I mean, the challenges then, I mean, granted, I mean, they've been incarcerated for, as you mentioned, could be a quarter century. It could be just 3 or 4 years. But there are, I mean, the road these guys face if they want to be reintegrated into society, it ain't that easy. I mean, it is challenging. And plus, there's I guess, the social stigma of having, of having been known as being having been incarcerated.
Absolutely. It's the scarlet letter, which this time is F for felon.
Mhm.
I know of one gentleman, he went to prison when he was a teenager in the Washington, D.C. area. Today, he's a thriving entrepreneur.
Mhm.
He said that when he left prison, even though he had paid his debt to society,
Mhm.
even though his fees by not right now are paid,
Mhm.
even though he was doing the right thing,
Mhm.
even though he had a great business model, when
Right.
people would learn he's a felon, they would step back. But I
Uh-huh.
want people who are formerly incarcerated to understand that I understand why people initially go, hey, wait a minute,
Right.
what's the story?
Right.
So we're still dealing with that, the stigma of being a felon, but we also have to accept the fact that people, in fact, in many instances, did commit the crimes
Mhm.
in which they were incarcerated for,
Mhm.
and that the natural, not the natural, but some would say the Pavlovian response to, wait a minute, what's going on,
Right.
is something that shouldn't be a hindrance, but it's something that people are working through.
Right. Right. Okay. I mean, I mean, I'm sure there are quite a few people out there who think, if they find out the person they're dealing with used to be incarcerated, and they think, as you mentioned, it's Pavlovian reflex, I guess. I mean, can't trust them, can't work with them. Why care about them? So just to address a possible concern like that, are a lot of these people in general, trustworthy?
Well, I can't make that value judgment because each person has his or her own bellwether for what they think trustworthiness looks like.
Okay.
But let's also talk about the type of crime.
Right.
If it's rape,
Mhm.
if it's child molestation,
Mhm.
that has its own set of post incarceration limitations. For example, you can't work with children.
Mhm.
There are certain jobs you cannot get. If you had a drug dependency problem, there are
Mhm.
probably certain industries where you're going to be limited in
Mhm.
your ability to get a job there, or if you do get a job, to move up the ladder.
Mhm.
There's research published by SHRM,
Mhm.
Society for Human Resource Management,
Mhm.
and they researched or got data from a number of executives
Mhm.
and C-suite level people who are involved in hiring people. And guess what? Over 80% of them said, yeah, in fact, we would hire someone who was formerly incarcerated.
Mhm.
However,
Mhm.
the number began to shift depending upon the type of crime.
Mhm.
And so again, if it's children, if it's rape,
Mhm.
if it's elderly,
Mhm.
there's some factors that come into place. So
I see.
yeah, it's very nuanced.
Okay, so it's like, as you said, it's nuanced. It's not just like a how do you put it, a one blanket covers everything kind of deal.
Correct.
All right, okay. So, Gerald, let's get on to the subject matter covered in the book. I mean, this is about educating people who are incarcerated or who have been incarcerated, so they can re-enter society. Just, how big of a deal is it if these guys are educated?
So there are research proposals, or really research studies coming out of organizations like the RAND Corporation, which is one place a lot of people look to with identify the return on investment.
Mhm.
That we receive over $4 worth of return on investment for every dollar invested
Mhm.
into an educational program. That could be correctional based, which is again adult basic education, adult secondary education,
Right.
or we can also look at post secondary options. We know that people, for example, in Texas, who are part of the prison entrepreneurship program, they go through a 9-month program, earn a certificate in entrepreneurship from Baylor University. Their recidivism rate, which means the ability, the chances, the fact that how many of them went back to prison, is only 7%, when it's double digits for the state and double digits nationally. We've identified research from women in New York who were in a state prison. Just the women who participated in the program in the absence of actually earning a degree or a certificate, simply being involved in a program reduced the likelihood that they would go to prison. And there's other research coming out of the Minnesota Department of Corrections. So there's research there. But let's also put on the table that there's some people who believe that the research methods aren't as strong as they should be. So there are methodological questions. There are questions about sample size and selection bias. Well, I've read both sides of the fence, and I come to at least 2 conclusions. Number one, we surely need better research methods to not only structure great questions, but we also need to come up with better solutions. And number 2, a lot of this focuses on implementation. You can have a great research plan. You can have a great plan to address it, but without implementation, it's going to be tough. And I say that because in our book, in chapter 4, Nancy Levine wrote a chapter called Reentry Programs, Evaluation Methods, and the Importance of Fidelity. And in there, she makes the case when someone raises the question, well, do education prison programs work? She says, yes, and sometimes, but not for everybody, and here's why. Her case is that implementation fidelity makes a lot of sense. So, like the other question, it's nuanced, but what I will say is the number of people that I have spoken to who said taking a course, earning a certificate, maybe earning a diploma or a degree, had a tremendous impact upon self-worth. It also made him or her less likely to be involved in violent activities in a prison. In fact, I've talked to prison wardens who said, you know what, when the education program was introduced into my facility, I saw the number of people being referred who were in that program being referred to suspension or to the hold or to some type of disciplinary method. They began to decrease. So there's a safety factor of a role of education on prison personnel who work there.
Okay, so it really sounds like this a win-win situation. I mean, the correctional officers they get a win out of it. I mean, they're not stressed at often. Those incarcerated, they get something out of it. Once they get out, they have they have more self-assurance, more self-confidence, more self-worth. And once they return to the workforce, I mean, they are viable people who work a job. So it sounds to me like this is like kind of like a win-win thing.
It's a win-win in certain circumstances, but there's also a win, but how and why. We definitely need much more research. And remember, not everyone who enrolls in a correctional education program is successful. Some of them, in fact, have returned to prison. Some of them, in fact, have gone to jail. Some of them, in fact, have been involved in violent activities, even though they're involved in an education program. So just because we have education doesn't mean everyone's going to be liberated. There's also some self-decision makers, I would say internal decision making that people have to make. There's also external variables outside of prison that may drive someone, or at least they entice someone, because again, there's free choice, that may entice someone to return back to a life of crime. So it's not a panacea. So it's a win-win in certain situations, but the bigger point is when, why, and how, and why not everyone.
All right. Okay. All right, got that. So, Gerald, sorry, with regard to the present system, I mean, let's face it, it ain't perfect as it is right now. What kinds of reform would you like to see have done in the present system?
I just take a look at the First Step Act, which President Trump signed into law in December 2018. It was a bipartisan effort, one of the few that we see right now in Washington, D.C., where they said focus on training for the workforce is important. A focus on academic programs, which can include everything, again, from the programs that are currently in place or an expansion of, this is only my read, an expansion of the Second Chance Pell Pilot Initiative, which was created in 2015 under President Obama.
Mhm.
In 2016, at the time, 67 post-secondary institutions partnered with a correctional facility, and through that partnership, they're now able to award an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or a certificate to
Mhm.
people who are incarcerated. So that could be part of it. It was also giving judges more decision making on how to impact sentencing.
Mhm.
So there are things that we can do just from that law, which I think is a step in the right direction. But
Right.
again, that's only for federal prisons. The
Uh-huh.
majority of people in the United States are in state prisons.
Right.
So I would say take a look at the work going on in Texas, in Georgia, in Kentucky, and
Uh-huh.
even far west of my former home state of California,
Mhm. Okay.
for
S-
examples.
So, would you say then that, excuse me, things are moving more or less in the direction that you'd want?
I won't say it's moving in the direction that I want because I'm just one person in a
Okay.
320 million person conversation.
Right.
What
Right.
I
Right.
would say is the conversation is moving away from punitive only
Mm,
toward the theory of rehabilitation.
mhm.
Because in many ways, the question about, what's the role of prisons in American society? That's a 200 plus year old question.
Right.
Is it solely for punishment?
Uh-huh.
Is it for rehabilitation or a combination thereof? So I think the current conversation is moving us from punitive only
Mhm.
toward, a new theory of rehabilitation. And for that, I think it's a movement in the right direction.
Nice. Okay. Okay. Cool. So, Gerald, let's say you came across someone who's just been released from prison, or even is presently in prison, or heck, is even a relative of someone who's been incarcerated, and they're concerned about how he or she will be able to make it, quote unquote, out there. What would be that one thing you would tell them?
Identify a program in your community
Mm-hmm.
that has a open arms approach to people like you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's easier said than done. We have some people who've been incarcerated, again, 26 years, who've never sent a text because when they were incarcerated, there was no iPhone.
Right. Right.
We have people who may have used a debit card, but a
Mm-hmm.
debit card used 26 years ago is radically different today.
Right.
Um, so I would say, and this is less on what people leaving prison can do. Here's where those who are interested on one end, social justice, on others, human dignity,
Right.
they need to make sure that people who are leaving the programs have literature to say, once you leave, go to block X, or we'll pick you up and we'll take you to transitional housing.
Uh-huh.
Or guess what? If you have transitional housing, we've got a job. Or if you're in need of medical assistance, there are people who do this. I think there's just an opportunity gap between services offered,
Mm-hmm.
people who need them, and the gulf is connecting the two. I expect the people who do the work to get on the ship and move toward those people. It's kind of a heavy lift to ask the people to come to us.
Yeah, yeah, good point. I mean, especially if they don't know who you are, they don't know what you do. I mean, how do they know where to go if they don't know who you guys are?
Exactly.
Right. Okay, cool. All right, so Gerald, in the last minute or so of this interview, are there any last words of wisdom you'd like to share, maybe to give our listeners some food for thought?
2 points. Number one, my support for incarceration for people who are incarcerated is no different for my support for education for all people in what I call the free world.
Mm,
I do believe that education for liberation is something that is not only important to you as a human being, but for those who have different faith traditions. There is a spiritual and moral element that education can bring to any human being. And so I just support it across the board. Number two, my support for providing education to incarcerated men and women, often at public support, although I also support the role of the private sector, in no way means that I support taking dollars away from people who are incarcerated.
mm,
So, for example, I support the use of Pell Grants and the use of Pell Grants for people who are incarcerated to earn a degree.
mm,
What I often hear is someone saying, wait a minute, that's not fair. You're
mm,
taking a Pell Grant away from Alex, who hasn't committed a crime, and you're giving it to Gerard.
mm,
Well, that argument was used in 1993 and 1994 to support what ultimately became the Clinton crime bill. that in fact was authored in the Senate by Joe Biden, that actually eliminated the use of Pell Grants for people who were incarcerated from 1994 up until 2016 when President Obama's program went into effect with support like people like former Secretary of Education John King. Now, that's been reinstated on a pilot basis only, and we've got people who are involved, and people say, oh, that's not fair. Well, guess what? Alex receiving a Pell Grant in no way means that Gerard's not going to receive one. It's not a sum zero game, so that's a myth. And then number two, if those people weren't incarcerated, they would qualify, many of them, for a Pell Grant because it's income based. So, and I think I end with a third point.
Okay.
We have to also make sure we talk about victims.
Okay.
There are men and women who are not going to see, and others, who are not going to see a loved one graduate. There's a young child who's not going to see, his or her dad come home and give him or her or give her a big hug.
Right.
There's people who've lost lovers and friends, and so I'm not unsympathetic to the fact that there are real people in the situation who will never get a chance to go to college because someone took away their life or distributed drugs to them and somehow impaired them. So in this conversation of education for liberation, I'm not solely focused on those who are incarcerated. I also want to keep in mind that there are real victims in this, physical, mental, and otherwise. I know personally, living with people and knowing people who've been victimized, they also have to have a place at the table when we talk about education for liberation because they need to be liberated as well.
Okay, so that's an interesting point because I mean a lot of people they focus on the incarcerated, and all this stuff, but they don't also talk about the other side of the coin. So that is an interesting point.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So all right then. So then, in closing, the book is Education for Liberation: The Politics of Promise and Reform Inside and Beyond America's Prisons. The authors are guest Gerald Robinson. And you can find this book on Amazon. So Gerald, thank you very much for being an author story. Thank you very much for enlightening us about your work and about your cause.
Thank you for your time, and feel free to reach out to me when you would have another discussion.
All right, cool. We'll definitely do that. Okay, everyone. So check out Education for Liberation, and for a gander at more awesome authors and great books, be sure to subscribe to our channel. So I'll see you all next time on Author Story, where we speak to another fantastic author about another fantastic book.